Would anyone like to start so that I don't have to? Yes, okay. Martina.
Thank you all for your wonderful papers. I've been really struck by this morning and also yesterday that we're so often looking at photographs embedded in the context of books, albums, and these physical objects. And I mean, it's a real challenge for us as scholars and as curators. You know, we're talking about atmosphere, but then we're looking at obviously a very different iteration of those images. So I guess that challenge is just in my head. We had a breakout session where we tried to look at some of the actual objects and think about how they can be incorporated into exhibitions, for example, so that one reconnects with the physical object. But I guess I just wanted to push a little bit more, and maybe in particular Lynn, to, I mean, the way you described the printing process and was utterly compelling and evocative. I just wondered about the experience of picture post and the flimsy paper. This is kind of a question that I wish Paul Messier was here to ask. I don't know if he's here. But in thinking about the relationship between the photograph, the printing process, and then the kind of paper that it sits on and how the paper creates atmosphere or creates its own tonal values. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I don't know if anyone else wants to add to this. So in the work that I've been doing on post-war British art and culture, I've tried to structure it around a dialogue between what Picture Post calls this rich grey scale, which is astonishing. For me, I mean, I've almost got to the point where, it hits me like a blow every time I look at these photographs, because the subtlety of these kind of curtains of deeper shades of grey, the highlights, are quite extraordinary, and for me are they constitute a grain in the image that is the way that the landscape itself in post-war bombed Britain is being described. So, I use the word synergy, but it's like there's a synergy between the granularity of the press photograph because of the way it's being printed, on the kind of paper it's being printed on, and this kind of gritty, and they're not ruins, they're bomb sites. So they've been cleared, but there's nothing there. And it's almost like the surface of a news photograph. So for me, this grayscale is very much the kind of the medium and tones of austerity Britain. And then weaving in and out of that is the story of post-war colour, which is a discourse of race and of chromatic hue, which are then in themselves woven into each other. So these seem to me to kind of articulate major debates in the period about who the nation is, after the war. How does the welfare system work? What isn't working? It seems to me that they're being expressed in very, very profound and expressive ways. There's an aesthetic in them that is also socially and politically expressive.
Just to observe that if you were to compare a 1941 Picture Post, just the weight and the turning with a copy of Life magazine, then the first thing that would hit you would be the fact that Life is on coated paper. Yeah. Picture Post is fragile. I used to own whole runs of unbound Picture Post, and eventually my doctor told me to get rid of them because they were a health hazard. They disintegrated. They were disintegrated. And I think that I love your allegory between the materiality and political, and that feeling of a disintegrating culture. Something that Bill Brand said, London or England was Victorian until 1945. So that feeling of something
But you know,
passing away in your hands.
But David, the Victorians never go away.
They never
That's
go
the
away.
other thing, you know. So the Victorians weave in and out, and
Yeah.
the Edwardians and the Beatles and the Magical Mystery Tour is also a kind of fantasy, you know. Yeah.
I think this is addressed to all three of you, but I was wondering if you could help us get to the bottom of the aesthetics of documentary photography, and the types that you're analysing, and the ways in which that aesthetics relates to narratives of Britishness, or coherent narratives of Britishness. There was a phrase that I think you quoted, David, which seemed to perfectly capture what does seem to be right at the heart of the documentary photography we've been looking at today and in Martin's talk yesterday, which is this juxtaposition of elements seemingly unrelated. And so you're conjuring up something that seems to be very central to so much of the material we've been looking at, whether within the image or even in terms of the ways in which the images are organised, which is this collage-like combination of elements that we as viewers or readers are asked to stitch together in some ways, but that in so many ways seem seemingly unrelated. So I'd like you to talk about which that seemingly unrelated juxtaposition of elements is at moments made coherent to tell stories about Britishness.
I think Siona maybe should say something, because what was so shocking about those open spreads was the again, it was almost German. that feeling of, you know, there were these people who, I have to say, would have been recognised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bobby Roberts, the hero
Yeah.
of Kandahar
Baldwin.
or whatever, and then Lord Baldwin,
Yeah.
who had been Prime Minister,
Yeah.
walking. So there were anchoring points, but on the whole, they stood as these decorative absurdities
Yeah.
of patriarchal power, as
Yeah.
you say. But they're still a shock. The way they've been arranged is a shock. So there's something about that documentary dislocative effect.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, I'm trying not to think of them exactly as documentary photographs.
No.
I mean, there's this sort of, anyway, bifurcation in documentary from the stylistic Martin's work, yeah, versus the jobbing photographer who shows up to take a picture of the ridiculous, you know, pomp and circumstance of, you know, a university procession or, you know, some kind of event, which, you know, when you see these presented in a book like Three Guineas, I don't think they read as documentary.
No.
They read as, that's why I use this term ready-made.
Yeah.
You know, so something more akin to the surrealist use of the photograph in the journal, as opposed, you know, in various journals and books, not actually about the kind of aesthetics that, you know, Lynda was talking about at all. Whereas there is a discussion of documentary aesthetics, which is the Spanish Civil War photographs, the first media war, and so, you know, that photographers as well as volunteers flock to. You know, it's this incredible, and it begins, you know, a kind of debate about documentary and veracity in the history of photography. And so I think that there's a complex discussion in the text about documentary as it's emerging, but these images are made so other, even though they're so conventional and everyday, and, you know, but they become something else.
I think the language that photography develops as well draws on historic modes of representation. So the face and hands, and, you know, that is important to the aesthetic. And I also think, you know, my own method is that you need to see photography in the context of other visual media. So you mentioned Grierson, and during the war, Millions Like Us, and, you know, the way that an ordinary life takes on this symbolic role of representing a region, a city, the capital, Englishness. And I do think there's a lot more to get to with what we mean binational identity in this period. It's complex. It's really Britishness, I think, looking at the post-war period. But, you know, I think that it's the way that the ordinary comes to stand for these other bigger collectivities within the shape of the state at particular moments.
You know, it struck me yesterday, and I think somebody made this comment in another way, that, and we keep making slips, like David, you made the slip and said this is a conference about Englishness. I kind of think that the only people that really talk about Britishness are the English.
Well, because
And
they think
because they're yeah, exactly. And you know, like my family, one half are Scottish, and they never talk about Britishness. Whereas English, I've been at events where English people insist that we talk about, you know, that you say British. No Welsh person or Scot would use that term, so it's very relative. I don't know, it's kind of...
It's interesting, Picture Post in 1938 decides to feature provincial towns. It sends Humphrey Spender and...
Of course, mass observation, of course, it was all about the provincial.
So you move out. That's why I was quite keen to show this as a Birmingham and Warwickshire phenomenon. And we're right, it is embarrassing, Englishness and Britishness.
I just want to make a couple of observations. First, on the printing. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that gravure originated from Eastern Europe, from Germany, and then was brought across by the sort of refugees who founded Picture Post. So it's inevitable, therefore, that they ended up with that technique rather than copying the sort of coated papers of Life magazine. And in fact, I mean, some of the best gravure printing we didn't see so much in the UK was with Bill Grant's book. If you look at Night in London, English at Home, the printing there is even more exceptional than Picture Post. But if you look at the books that were published in Eastern Europe, France, everywhere, gravure was all over the place, you know, so we were really just catching up with the other trends in Europe. So the way you're arguing is if we were pioneering gravure, but it's not the case at all. We were also runs in terms of the gravure discussion and argument. And then about Bert Hardy, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about him is that he was a working photographer. He was being commissioned, and his real aim, as was Picture Post, was to describe the narrative. What became interesting for my generation is when we saw the language of the spatial awareness in photography, which had been developed so incredibly in America in the 60s, learned by Tony Ray Jones and then brought across, and this suddenly felt something entirely different. And this is a thing that excited this new generation of photographers. So there's a difference between narrative description of how you display an event and the spatial awareness, which David has pointed out Stone had as part of his vocabulary, but that's the thing that he picked up, and that's the real difference between, say, Bert Hardy and Tony Ray Jones. And the other thing, Tony Ray Jones was taking these pictures just because he wanted to take them. He wasn't being commissioned. Hardy was a working photographer.
Yeah, I mean,
he was... There's a huge difference between the photographer
yes, he was a staff photographer
and pays for their work themselves, rather than someone who's doing a commission. And I think you have to understand that in differentiating between these two strands in British photography.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't differentiating the two strands, and I think the point about what I was saying was innovative about Picture Post was not its adoption of the printing method, but its use of a kind of visual design that came from the German Weimar tradition and the émigrés who kind of brought that with them. The Sun printers was, you know, they were committed to working with and modernising and introducing new kinds of inks, and you know, it seems to me that that should be acknowledged also. And the paper rationing went on till I think 1954. So it was, and you know, Picture Post and other newspapers used to say, you will get two more pages in your issue next week because the ration has been increased. And I think that is a reality that is very easy to overlook, but which also contributes to what you know, what we see as a kind of archive now. Thank you.
just one more point, but Bert Hardy would always refer to himself as a smudger. A smudger. And it's interesting, that was, I was talking to him in the early 70s about this, and somehow that immediately evokes this world of industrial messiness, and it was a Victorian phrase, a smudger. And actually, David Bailey, who were suddenly to pull somebody else into the frame, also, ironically, now that's the crucial thing, Bert's not being ironic, but when Bailey calls himself a smudger, as he does, he's looking
and
back
it's
at
a kind of Cockney authenticity as well, isn't it? When Bailey is saying it, he knows a smudger's a kind of late 19th century printing, a kind of a worker, you know. I think, and of course Hardy said that Brandt was the most contrasty photographer on picture post.
And I think on that note, we will break for lunch, and please warmly thank our 3 speakers for the morning.